Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. In 1946, a minor league team, the Spokane Indians, were driving in their bus on the way to their next game. The bus swerved out of the way of an oncoming car and tumbled down a hill, killing 6 players and injuring the remaining 9. Their stories have been largely forgotten. Eric Vickrey's book, Season of Shattered Dreams, Postwar Baseball, the Spokane Indians, and a tragic bus crash that changed everything, tells the stories of these lives before and after the crash. It's a fascinating part of baseball history that I had never heard of, and is much more than a single event. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Eric. How are you doing today?
Great, Scott. How are you today?
You know what? I'm doing just fine. This book is fascinating, and for what seems like a singular event, there's a lot that goes into this. I was hoping that you could sort of situate us here before we kind of get into the story. What is baseball like after the war, specifically on the West Coast?
Yeah, so this story takes place in 1946, which is, of course, the year after World War II. So at that point in time, you had thousands of servicemen returning from the war who had left their baseball careers to go fight in the war and were now looking to resume their careers. At least in terms of baseball, that's kind of what the landscape looked like. Of course, Major League Baseball had continued on during the war, but for the most part, the minor leagues, by and large, shut down during the Second World War. There were 44 minor leagues in operation before the war and 9 during the war. So in 46, all these leagues were kind of starting back up again. You had training camps full of players looking to resume their careers. And my book focuses on one of those teams, the Spokane Indians, which were a Class B team in the Western International League, which would be roughly equivalent to like a high A or double A team today. The Indians were a independent franchise, so they weren't affiliated with one particular team, but they had players from the Yankees and 2 Pacific Coast League teams, the Oakland Oaks and San Diego Padres. So that's kind of where this book is about that team, and set in 46, just after the war.
So how would you describe these players? Are these largely up-and-coming prospects? Are they guys who have kind of been trying to get back to where they were? What are these guys like?
So it was really a mix of talented players. You did have a couple of guys who had played previously in the big leagues. Ben Garrity and Chris Hartshee both had cups of coffee with the Brooklyn Dodgers years before. And then you had some guys who were really on the way up when the war broke out. Guys like Jack Lorkey and Bob Patterson, Freddie Martinez, who were kind of in their early 20s, just coming up, about to break onto the scene and maybe move up to the Pacific Coast League when the war started. Those guys had served for 3 or 4 years in the war and were now in their early to mid 20s looking to resume their careers. And then you had a guy like Vic Pichetti, who was the youngest player on the team, who was 18 years old and by all accounts was the best prospect on the team. He had been heavily recruited by all 16 major league teams and was a surefire future big leaguer. So kind of a mix of talented players up and down the roster.
So this is really kind of a complicated subject. What was your goal when you were approaching writing this book? What was the story that you wanted to try to tell here?
So, I learned about this accident 3 or 4 years ago. Despite being a lifelong baseball fan, had really never heard of the story. In talking to lifelong fans like yourself, most people just don't know the story, and I think it's largely just kind of faded from the larger consciousness over time. So, as I kind of learned about the story, I did what we all do. I kind of went to Google and just started learning what I could and realized that there weren't a whole lot of articles out there. There really had never been a full-length book about this. There was one player, Jack Lorkey, whose story is probably the most well-known. He played in the major leagues for 7 seasons with the Giants and Phillies and had a really remarkable life. And so his story was out there, but I got to thinking that there were, a whole roster full of players whose stories hadn't been told. And I had done a lot of writing through the Society for American Baseball Research, kind of doing biographies on players. So kind of always interested in the human stories and kind of digging into those interesting those stories from our past. So that's kind of what I set out to do, is just tell the stories of the players who had been forgotten over time.
I think that there are probably three guys that you really sort of focus in on more than the rest. In you mentioned all of them in Pinchetti, Garrity, and Lorky. How do you end up
Mhm.
focusing on those guys? What was about them that really kind of appealed to you?
Well, there are a few things. First of all, I tried to collect as much information as I could about each individual on the roster, and in some cases that was a lot easier than others. These are men who've been gone for, in some cases, close to 80 years now. Um, some of them have relatives who are still living. Who were able to provide a wealth of information. And in other cases, I just really couldn't find much out there at all. These players either had no living descendants that I could track down, or there's weren't a lot of like newspaper articles written about them. So I think in these three cases, like Pachetti, for instance, I got in touch with his family. They had a scrapbook full of photos, articles, letters, which helped me tell his story. In the case of Ben Garrity, he was a former big leaguer who then survived the crash to have a long managerial career. So there was a lot of information I found out about him. And then, of course, Lorky, as we discussed, he had a really fascinating life. So his story in itself is probably worthy of a book. But so that's kind of why I settled on honing in on those three players in particular.
So let's go to the 46 season. How is Spokane doing? What's happening in their season leading up to the crash at this point?
Yeah, so they were in an 8-team league, the Western International League, which included teams in British Columbia, Washington State, and Oregon. And it was a very competitive league. The Indians were 6 games above 500 in late June, and were 5 games out of first behind the Salem Senators and a few other teams. They were certainly going to make a run at the pennant. And back in those days, the minor leagues, it was more about um, winning the pennant and drawing fans rather than like player development. We think the minor leagues now is mostly there for player development. Back then, it was a big source of entertainment in these cities across the country and in these towns. In Spokane, for instance, these players were local celebrities, so they were doing very well and had certainly a shot at the pennant that year. And then unfortunately, tragedy struck in late June.
From what you can gather, what happens?
On June 23rd, they had a sort of this dramatic come from behind victory over the first place Salem Senators, and so they were pretty, riding high in good spirits. And it was actually the next morning that they reconvened and boarded the bus, and then drove across Washington State. Their next series was in Bremerton, which is just across the Puget Sound from Seattle. So they had a kind of long journey. Back then, it was just a 2-lane road connecting Spokane to Seattle, and something like an 8 to 10 hour drive. It was a much more brutal way of traveling now than we think of these days. They stopped in Ellensburg, which is a town in central Washington. They ate dinner, and it was at that time that Jack Lorky got a message that he was being called up to the San Diego Padres. So he said goodbye to his teammates, actually hitchhiked back to Spokane, and the rest of the team carried on. And it was about an hour later as the team reached Snoqualmie Pass in the Cascade Mountains. Just before dusk is when the accident occurred.
So I'm one of these guys who, when I read a book, I always want to research the places that these things happen. Are any of
Mm-hmm.
these places still around? Is the road still used? The restaurant are these places still here?
Yeah, so as part of my research for this book, I actually kind of retraced the path of the team. US Route 10, which was the 2-lane road that they traveled on, still exists in some areas. It's in other areas it's been replaced by Interstate 90. But the restaurant they ate at in Ellensburg called Webster's Cafe is still there. It's now I believe, a wine bar, but the building is still there. And then the road that the accident occurred on, US Route 10 near Snoqualmie Pass, is still there as well. It's now a Forest Service road that is accessible. So I was able to narrow down exactly where the crash occurred. There's no marker or anything, but just based on um, just newspaper descriptions and eyewitness accounts and things, I was able to pinpoint pretty much where the accident occurred.
I was going to ask about that because I go play baseball every year in Turin, Italy, and the whole team, in fact, in 1949, died in a plane crash. Football team, and it is still to this day a very major event. They still commemorate it every year. There's a big plaque where it happened. Is there anything like that today for this team?
Surprisingly, there's not. Not at the stadium where the Spokane Indians play. The Indians still exist as a franchise. Very long. They've been around for over a century. But there's no marker at the stadium. They did in last year's program. They had a 3 or 4 page story about that team, but there's no physical plaque or anything at the ballpark. And similarly, at the crash site, there's no marker of any kind. Surprisingly.
Any idea why that is?
It's a great question. I think it's something that's just been, in some ways, forgotten over time. I think that the people who were largely involved in this crash have mostly passed on. There are a few people, family members, who have recollections of the players involved. Some of the players who survived the crash actually lived into the 21st century. I've explored that with SABR, the organization I'm involved in. They have a landmarks committee, so that's something we're looking into as far as maybe getting a physical plaque or something at the site.
What is the outcome here for this team at that point?
Including Lorkie, there were 16 players on the bus when it left Spokane. Lorkie, left the team in Ellensburg, so there were 15 players left on the bus, and then the bus driver. The bus careened down a rocky ravine about 300 feet, rolled down, caught fire as it rolled, and some of the players were ejected from the bus. Some sustained burns, others had crush-type injuries. In total, 9 players were killed, 6 players survived, and the bus driver also survived. And then, by incredible happenstance, there were 2 players that had actually driven separately from the team. So you had Lorkie and then these 2 players who were not on the bus, but the rest of the team was all there, and unfortunately only 6 survived.
In the immediate aftermath of the accident, what happens to this team?
Yeah, so a few of the players who survived had prolonged hospitalizations. A couple were discharged within a few days with minor injuries. And then one of the things that really surprised me in kind of researching this is that the team actually started playing games, sort of reorganized and started playing games just a week after the accident, which is pretty shocking, considering that they only had the 2 players who drove separately were the only sort of able-bodied players left. But I guess if you look at it from the owner's standpoint, the guy named Sam Collins, who owned the team, this was his business. So he was, I think, looking to field a team, and there were quotes saying, that's what the boys would have wanted. They would have wanted the team to carry on. So they rounded up players that were released by other organizations, semi-pro players, even their team trainer played third base for some games. It was just kind of a hodgepodge of players that they were able to get to play, and the results were pretty unsuccessful. The team was 30 games under 500 for the rest of the season. But there was an outpouring of support from across the country. The story made newspaper headlines coast to coast. There were donations started pouring in as far as supporting the players who survived and the families of the victims of the crash.
In the book, I don't remember the number, but it's a shockingly high number of these players continuing to play ball.
Yeah, so of the 6 players who survived the crash, 5 of them were able to resume their professional baseball careers, though a few of them did have sort of these nagging injuries from the crash that resulted in pretty brief careers. Even the guy who was most severely injured, a guy named Dick Powers, actually eventually played some semi-pro ball as a pitcher. And then what's kind of ironic is the 2 players who drove separately, they were pitching almost on 2 or 3 days rest for the rest of the year because they were the only players remaining. And both of them ended up having arm injuries. So even though they weren't directly involved in the crash, even they were sort of indirectly impacted by just having to log tons of innings as a result. So so surprisingly, many of them did resume their careers, but unfortunately, they were mostly brief after that.
How did they deal with the crash going forward?
There were a few different ways that they coped. And this came from articles that were written over the years and quotes from some of the survivors. You had guys like Jack Lorkey and a couple of the other players who survived the crash just kind of put it out of their mind and had never really talked about it. And they were very reluctant to talk about it when asked. A couple other players like Gus Hallberg, one of the players who survived, he gave many interviews over the years and kind of described the crash itself and just kind of what he remembered from that team. In the case of Ben Garrity, he went on to have a long minor league managerial career, and he coped with sort of the traumatic memories of the crash by turning to alcohol. So a few different ways in which the survivors coped with the accident.
I did want to talk about Lorkey and Garrity a little bit in their post careers here. Let's start with Garrity. I find him a fascinating guy. I just did all the research for the Hank Aaron stamp, which was fascinating. I came across him. I had no idea that he was involved in the crash. He actually plays a very big role in Hank Aaron's life. When he joins the Sally League, he integrates the Sally League. And Garrity's his manager and is incredibly supportive of Hank during this really difficult time. And I believe there's a quote about him being either his greatest manager, most beloved manager. He actually had an incredibly successful career after this.
He did, yeah. He managed in the New York Giants farm system for a few years and then was hired by the Braves. And like you mentioned, in '53, he managed the Jacksonville Braves the year Hank Aaron played there. And yeah, by all accounts, was just a baseball savant. And he learned the game from Casey Stengel. That's who Garrity played for when he first came up with the Dodgers. So that was kind of his one of the guys he learned from. And he just became a student of the game. He realized he really didn't have what it took to become a player. So he set out as becoming a big league manager and ultimately wanted to make the Hall of Fame as a manager was his long-term goal. And I interviewed several players who played for Garrity, including Tommy John, Ted Kazansky, Gordy Lund, a few others. And all of them had very fond memories of Garrity and just said he was truly a genius when it came to baseball. And Garrity's actually a subject of the memoir False Spring by Pat Jordan. He's described in there as well as just how he was almost like a fatherly figure to his players, but also just incredibly intelligent baseball mind. Spent hours and hours after games just sort of replaying the games in his mind, going over baseball strategy, discussing it with his players. So truly a remarkable man who had a very successful career. And yeah, like you mentioned, Aaron called him the greatest manager he ever played for and perhaps the greatest manager who ever lived.
There are some great Tommy John quotes in that book about him. I was really impressed. I thought that Tommy John really sort of got to the humanity of him and the struggles that he really was continuing to face throughout his life.
Yeah, and Tommy played for him near the end of Garrity's life and career when he probably wasn't as sharp as he had been maybe a decade earlier. So Tommy's experience wasn't, I would say, as favorable as the other 5 players I interviewed, just because I think at that point the physical toll that years of alcoholism had taken on Garrity had really kind of caught up with him.
I wanted to talk about Jack Lorkey. He gets this nickname Lucky. When does that nickname come along, and why does that nickname come along?
Yeah, it was pretty much immediately after the crash, though it would have been an apt nickname even before because he had fought in World War II in the Battle of the Bulge and then had this sort of incredible near-death experience where he had sailed back to America following the war and was about to take the first flight of his life back home to California when he was bumped from the airplane kind of at the last minute. And that plane took off without him, much to his chagrin. The plane later stopped to refuel in Kansas City and then crashed, killed everyone on board. So he had already had sort of these near misses with mortality before he had joined the Spokane Indians in '46. And then it was really after this bus crash where he was called away just an hour beforehand that really the nickname Lucky started to appear almost every time his name was mentioned in newspapers.
And he was not a fan of this, correct?
He was not. He was never really comfortable with the nickname. Of course, you can understand why. It was sort of this constant reminder of those who weren't lucky, but it certainly rolls off the tongue, um, and whether he liked it or not, it pretty much stuck with him. Even in the first edition of the Baseball Encyclopedia that came out, I think in '69, he's not listed as Jack Lorky. He's listed as Lucky Lorky.
Oh, wow. So he goes on to actually have a solid career.
Yeah, he especially in his rookie year in '47 with the Giants. He hit 11 home runs that year. Actually got his first big league hit the same game that Jackie Robinson hit his first home run. Kind of a fun fact about Jack, but kind of then settled into a utility role in years after that. Did appear in the '51 World Series with the Giants, had a couple of at-bats, played for a couple seasons with the Phillies, and then came back to the Pacific Coast League and played for several years there. So had a pretty long and successful career.
Were there any other players on the team that you really liked their story, but you couldn't maybe find enough about them, or it just wasn't as much as you could find on the other guys?
For sure. Yeah, there was the guy who was actually leading the team in hitting. His name was George Risk. And I was able to find out very little about him. He had served in the Army during the war, was stationed in Utah, um, was an infielder from Oregon, but really couldn't find out much more about him. So he's a little bit of a mystery. Another guy, Freddie Martinez, who is Jack Lorky's roommate, actually, was another up and coming player who I think was second on the team in batting average. So he was another guy who I just couldn't find a lot of information about him. So I wish I could have, been able to dig into their stories a little bit more. But um, hopefully, I did them justice at least by describing their part in this team and in that year.
So you're talking about how you reached out to the families. How many
Mhm.
families were you able to contact? What kind of things were they showing you, or the stories they were kind of telling you?
Yeah, so I tried to reach out to uh, family members for every player. Of the 16 players who were on the bus that day, I was able to get in touch with 12 of their families. And in a couple cases, there were, in the instance, George Riss, for example, I got in touch with, I think it was his great niece or like a second cousin, someone somewhat removed. And she knew of him, but that was about the extent of her knowledge. And then there were other players like Pachetti, for example, and a guy, Bob Patterson. Their families had all these letters and scrapbooks and photos and things, and had kind of just held on to these artifacts over time. And they were very anxious for their relatives' stories to be told. And hopefully they're happy with how the book came out. But that was a very rewarding part of it, is just sort of uh, bringing to light these stories of these guys who had long been forgotten.
Has anything happened since the book has come out?
Well, the book came out in mid-April. I did a signing at a bookstore called Auntie's in Spokane about a week after it came out, and there was a newspaper article in the local paper there, the Spokesman Review, uh, and so that's how a lot of people found out about it in Spokane. And a gentleman in his 90s showed up to the signing, who actually worked at Ferris Field, where the Indians played in '46, and remembered many of the players. Was good friends with the Bat Boy, grew up with him. Unfortunately, I wish I would have known about this guy, beforehand. I would have loved to have included his memories in the book. I was able to do a signing at a Spokane Indians game this year, which was really cool. Just I think a lot of people in Spokane know the story just over the years. But outside of Spokane, I think it's mostly been forgotten. But yeah, I think the book's been well received, and I've got a lot of positive feedback about it.
Do you have any idea why it's just been sort of a largely forgotten story?
It was a minor league team with not a lot of household names. The Pacific Northwest, is always, it's kind of way out here, away from New York and Chicago and the big media hubs of our country. So I think sometimes things fly a little more under the radar out here. So that could be part of it. But I was surprised myself when I found that there had been some articles written about it, but nothing like a full-length narrative book about it. But actually, to this day, it remains the deadliest accident in the history of American professional sports, believe it or not. So,
Wow.
certainly a story that I felt needed to get out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also thought it was interesting because there weren't really any changes after that. Like, it's not like they gave up bus travel or anything like that. I mean, these guys
Yeah.
who kept playing, they were immediately getting back on the bus right after this, which is in itself is not an easy task, I imagine. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, to go through that and then to have to get on, the same type of buses. These were these like pre-war buses that, had largely kind of fallen into disrepair during the war. This is what these guys were riding. I guess in the Pacific Coast leagues they were riding in trains, but these lower leagues like the Western International League was all bus travel, and that's I think part of what Garrity, his dream of becoming a major league manager, he had to gain experience in the minors, and he did continue traveling on buses, and that was very difficult for him. There were stories of how he, coped with that, and he would sit right behind the bus driver and sort of just keep his eyes out the whole time. Yeah, I just can't imagine what that was like for him.
That was Eric Vickrey. His book, Season of Shattered Dreams, Postwar Baseball, the Spokane Indians, and a Tragic Bus Crash That Changed Everything is out now. To close us out, we have Linsday Borden reading her short story Glimmering from our 16th issue.
Glimmering by Linsday Borden. Slumped on the bench, sitting back on your tailbone, spitting out sunflower shells, John and Chine, taking in the game. That was Randy Little's idea of heaven, and he had already spent an eternity there. His playing days were so long gone, they were like somebody else's youth. Could that slender left-hander really have been him? Seems unlikely. That fiery, mediocre pitcher who'd blown out his arm early and reinvented himself as a fair to middling fielder. Him? In his mind, he saw that scrappy young player so clear, kind of tenderly, too, almost like a son. Heck, anymore like a grandson. No, more like someone else's grandkid. Someone close, but not bone close. Fact was, when he thought back over his childhood idols, those ball players he'd grown up rooting for, well, there he was, his own young self, taken his place among them. Not the best of them, not near. More like that guy you pulled for and hoped for, and more often than not ended up shaking your head over or nearly falling over backwards when he actually came through. Then had come all those years of coaching and managing and coaching again. Those years he put together and added on to what he'd learned in years of watching and waiting and soaking the game up right into his flesh. He was soggy with it now, boy. Baseball knowledge practically oozed from him, but the more that seeped out, the more he absorbed. I must have seen it all, he thought, but there's always more to see if you keep your eyes open. Long years, decades now, of growing up and growing old in a boy's game. And maybe he couldn't remember exactly what year it was that he had struck out the side on 9 pitches or had grounded out to short in the bottom of the 9th in that game against New York. Maybe he couldn't remember exactly if a rookie Marcus Smith had been playing for Boston or Detroit that time he'd been caught in a rundown that must have lasted a good minute and a half. But Little remembered clear as anything that high, meaty fastball he'd got away with to Powell before reaching back and finishing him off with an 0-2 sinker. Remembered standing in against Nichols that year he won Cy Young and MVP, whenever that was, and knowing the cutter was coming and still getting jammed up and in, feeling the jolt of his bat splintering and starting down the line, holding what was left of the handle and knowing he'd been flummoxed yet again, but this time by one of the best there was. He could almost feel his blood pound, thinking of standing on the dugout steps and screaming, "Tag him, tag him, tag him, tag him," as if his fielders weren't trying their damnedest to do just that, while Smith danced back and forth between them like a boy, grinning and sparking, as if there were no dark years of illness and addiction and poverty ahead of him, as if he had all the time in the world to dance along the base path, driving the infield to distraction and the crowd to its feet. Clear as water. Clear and shining like a shard of glass, glinting like ice, layer on layer of memory. The sweet swing of Inohito glimmering fathoms down below the sweet swing of Jordan. The galloping stride of Masterson echoing length for length the galloping grace of Bonds. Speaker Jones stealing second over the headfirst slide of Henderson on top of the belly-flopping swoosh of... What was that? Way down deep. Sneaking in under the tag. Down there in the shadows. Scrappy little Randy Little. Will you look at that? No wonder Little's old eyes glittered beneath their sleepy lids. Bring him in, you think, Gopher? Nah, Kendi. This kid can't bunt. Hands ain't soft enough. They're only bluffing. Mover kept his infield back. And after 2 failed bunt attempts, the kid at the plate lined straight to Jones and into the double play.
We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,